Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for September 22nd, 2021. Yesterday in New York City, the United Nations General Assembly opened their annual fall session, which included speakers from a number of the leading countries that are members of the United Nations, including Xi Jinping of China, Joe Biden from the United States, and I'll cover somewhat of what they had to say. But out in front of the United Nations, there was a LaRouche Organization rally, which I think defined what the central issue confronting leaders meeting at this UNGA assembly have to deal with. And that is the question of development versus depopulation. Among the signs we had were one which read, "Feed the world, build the land bridge." This, of course, is a reference to the upcoming World Food Systems Summit, which includes efforts by leading environmentalists to ban meat consumption, have non-natural food production eliminated, in other words, fertilizers and the like. Also, signs included China and Russia are not the enemy, global Britain is. And we had a leaflet which essentially defined these issues from the standpoint of Helga Zepp-LaRouche's insistence that here is an opportunity to take the end of the war in Afghanistan to define a new policy based on development, under the slogan coming from the encyclical by Pope Paul VI from the late 1960s, "Development is the new name for peace." And so that was our presence there. Now, at the same time, the depopulation side was led by none other than Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He was there to promote the upcoming COP26 summit, which is the continuation of the Paris Climate Accord, which will be meeting beginning November 1st in Glasgow. But it's in trouble because there's so much opposition to what's being proposed, which is essentially an anti-development policy, which more properly is called a depopulation policy, to be directed against the poorest countries of the world. Johnson had set up for a heads of state meeting to take place yesterday as part of a summit. He expected 40 or more heads of state. As it is, only about 20 showed up, and a number of them were from smaller countries who complained about the anti-development policies that are a part of the COP26 agenda. Russia didn't show up, China didn't show up, neither did the United States, except with very low-level representatives. Now, Johnson's call for climate action, which he says is urgent and must take place, is really part of what should be a slogan, "Make the British Empire great again." This idea of global Britain is an assertion that the British, through their superior capabilities in economic power, military power, and so on, but essentially psychological warfare, should be the leading nation in shaping this agenda. And their intention has always been to have the United States be the enforcer of these policies. Now, Donald Trump was not so willing to do that. We're not sure what Biden is going to do, but when you see what his speech was, you'll get a sense that he's along the lines of Johnson. Biden and Johnson had a meeting later in the day at the Oval Office. Johnson obviously is pushing the U.S.-British so-called special relationship, as in the recently concluded Australia-UK-US deal, the new security partnership, which includes the United States sale of nuclear submarines to Australia. Now, Biden's speech yesterday was a complete travesty in that while speaking of peace, he was presenting a strategy which is not so different from what U.S. policy has been since the launching of these endless wars in 2001. Biden started by saying we are ending, quote, "a period of relentless war," unquote, to open a, quote, "a new era of relentless diplomacy." And he said, to do this, we must use the power of development aid to invest in new ways of lifting people up, of renewing and defending democracy, unquote. Now, this is replete with contradictions. I mean, what are the investments of new ways of lifting people up? The United States has just frozen $8 billion of Afghanistan government money that's absolutely necessary to feed the starving people. About half the population of Afghanistan, according to David Beasley of the World Food Program, are facing starvation. How are we lifting people up by withholding that money? How are we lifting people up by withholding the IMF special drawing rights that are needed for food and medical assistance in a country that has no food and is suffering from an escalation from the COVID pandemic? As for renewing and defending democracy, how do regime change operations fit in with renewing and defending democracy? What country is most involved right now, or what countries are most involved in overthrowing democratically elected governments? I would say it's the United States and the United Kingdom. Look at the situation. We're continuing regime change operations against Syria, against Venezuela. There's a gear up against Belarus, not to mention against Russia and China. This is renewing democracy. So explicit in Biden's statement is the contradiction. Now, he went on to say the U.S. is now preparing to turn our focus to the Indo-Pacific region with our partners. Who are the partners he identified? NATO. Well, the idea is that what's NATO doing? Just today, they're beginning military maneuvers in Ukraine, which is part of the targeting of Russia. There's discussion of a Pacific NATO. NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What's it doing in the Pacific Ocean? Oh yeah, renewing democracy. Now he also talks about the European Union as a partner. Well, the European Union was just jolted by the AUKUS deal, in which the United States dumped, and Australia and Britain dumped the French agreement with Australia to provide submarines, and imposed instead a British-US nuclear sub agreement as part of a new security arrangement. Meanwhile, the EU is still involved in anti-Russia and anti-China policies, some partner to promote democracy worldwide. And then there's the Quad, the third alliance he mentioned, which is Japan, India, Australia, and the United States, which is part of this confrontation with China in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, just to show the disconnect between his words and his actions, one might say his mental processes, he asserted that the U.S. is not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocs. Well, what about this AUKUS security arrangement? The whole point of it is to confront China, to bring Australia in as what some are calling the aircraft carrier for the United States, to prop up this image of British military power to contain China. So how is that not a military bloc? So you see in the language and in the actions and the extent to which the United States does go ahead in supporting the climate accords being pushed by Johnson, that it's a commitment for a new phase of unilateral policy. Unilateral meaning that the so-called rules-based order, which represents the rules demanded by the City of London and Wall Street bankers be enforced by U.S. military power, is still the game that's being played, as opposed to multilateralism, in which nations work together for mutually beneficial development policies. That was the essence of Xi Jinping's speech. Now, we can have more on this in the next couple of days as more of this session comes through, but what Xi Jinping emphasized is that nations have a longing for peace and development, and to achieve this, he proposed the creation of a global development initiative, which would put economic development as the priority for all nations. He pointed to Afghanistan as a contrary example, to show that military solutions will fail. And he reasserted the principle of non-interference to be replaced by multilateralism. Well, non-interference is what was overturned with the decision with the George W. Bush administration, which actually goes back before that the United States has a right to overthrow regimes which we find sufficiently undemocratic. Now, what are the rules that are applied there? The United Nations does not allow interference in other nations' affairs. Well, the United States went outside the United Nations for many of these wars. So this idea that we're going to the UN to establish the principles of the United States as a relentlessly diplomatic force in the world has yet to be demonstrated in practice. If it were demonstrated, it would be a good shift. But it's hard to see that coming from what Biden had to say, and more importantly, what Boris Johnson was doing behind the scenes, trying to reinforce the unilateral demands of London and Wall Street and the World Economic Forum of Davos, that development be written off. Why can't we develop poorer countries? Because the planet will boil over, according to the fake science that's being promoted by them. Instead, they somehow think that the path toward nuclear war is not connected to global warming. Well, nuclear war will warm up the world. So that's my report for today. We'll get more, I think, on this UN session tomorrow. I also want to cover the BBC admitting that they carried scandalous reporting, what they said were serious flaws in their reporting on so-called Syrian use of chemical weapons 2 years ago. But we'll pick that up either tomorrow or next week. Thanks for joining me. See you again.